Hi, this is William Bronchick, and welcome to this special video seminar presentation on financing properties. Finding the money to buy the properties is a crucial part of what we do as a real estate investor. However, I must first caution you not to get too caught up in finding the money first, and here's why. If you find a good real estate deal, for example, if you find a house worth $100,000 and you can buy it for $50 or $60, not too hard to find the money for a deal like that. If you find a house worth $100 and you want to buy it for no money down for $95,000, it gets a little more difficult. So while finding the financing source is important, don't get too hung up on just finding all your financing sources and getting them all lined up before you go out and make offers. You should do it both at the same time, but remember, the deal is more important than lining up the money. If you find the right deal, the money will find you. I want to talk about different money sources, borrowing from institutional lenders such as big mortgage companies and banks. I'm going to talk about private money. We're going to talk about owner financing, using partners, and all the different ways that you can finance properties, both the traditional way and the creative way, which is the more fun way. Now, the most important thing for real estate investors is the key here of leverage. Leverage, and that means using as little as your own money as possible to buy properties. Now, let's say you had $100,000 in the bank, and you can buy one property for $100,000 and just rent that out, let's say for $700 or $800 a month. That would bring you in a certain amount of cash flow, and that would do okay. That might be a pretty good return on your money. However, over the long term, if you're looking for long-term retirement wealth, increasing your wealth, that house will go up in value, certainly, but it's not going to go up as much in value as if you had 2 or 3 or 4 houses that you've leveraged. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's say you bought 5 houses, and you put $20,000 down on each of those 5 houses and borrowed $80,000. Well, now, of course, you wouldn't have as much cash flow because now you have debt to pay on those 5 properties. But if you had 5 houses, at least would break even or maybe a little bit of cash flow, so you'd have a little bit less cash flow overall. But in the end game, when you're retired 15 or 20 years from now, you're going to have 5 houses that will appreciate in value, and as you pay down the debt on those properties, you'll increase your equity. So leverage is important. Now, the other factor I really want to stress here is the risk. Real estate cycles go up and down. And sometimes we get lucky, sometimes we hit them right, sometimes we actually do some research and we hit them right. But not everyone is that good at predicting market cycles. Sometimes we buy at the top, sometimes we buy at the bottom. But in the long run, in the long term, if you buy in the right neighborhoods, if you apply the right principles, in the long run, you will generally end up wealthy if you hold on long enough. The key, however, is being able to hold on long enough, because it's easy when things are going up. When the market is going sideways or going down, that's when it gets troublesome. That's when rents start going down, vacancies start going up, and you could get into trouble. So you might have a couple of bad months or maybe even a couple of bad years, and if you can't handle the down times, you'll never make it to the end game, which is trying to get all this real estate owned free and clear at the end. If you buy real estate in the right areas, and you don't have to be a genius, you don't have to be buying it exactly at the right time at the right place, but if you just bought and hold on to a decent chunk of real estate for 15 or 20 years, you're going to be wealthy. You're going to be wealthy, but the key is to be able to hold on. And also the key is to be able to buy as many properties as you can to leverage your investment. So in the end game, you don't just have like maybe 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 properties, but you might have 10 or 20 or even 30 properties. So that might involve, going back to our $100,000 example, instead of buying 5 houses with $20,000 down on each one, let's buy 10 houses and put $10,000 down on each one. Well, now you're leveraging it even more. Now in those cases, if you're only putting 10% down, you're borrowing 90%, you might end up with possibly even negative cash flow. Even on paper, if it looks like it's break even, there's vacancies, there's unexpected repairs, there are bad times in the market. You just really never know. So really the most important thing here is not just how many properties you can buy, because buying properties with little or no money down is easy. I'll show you how to do that. That's a snap. The key is being able to handle when things go bad, because remember, cycles go up and down, up and down. If you can survive the down, you'll always do great in the up. So instead of buying 10 properties and putting, let's say, 10% down on each one, let's buy 15 properties and don't put any money down, and then take that $100,000 and just sit it in a bank account, just park it there, maybe in an interest-bearing account in case things go wrong, to handle negative cash flow, in case you have vacancies, in case you have an unexpected repair. You see, buying properties with no money down is easy. being able to survive the ups and downs of real estate, that's the most difficult part. I see a lot of people right now in the market buying properties with little or no money down, which is great, but they're getting rotten deals. I mean, they're paying pretty close to retail value with the expectation that they're going to make money when the market appreciates, and even though it's negative cash flow, they'll make it up when they sell. And that may be right. You may be right if you do that, but if you can't survive what goes wrong, or if you're wrong about the market and it flattens out and you have to wait 5 or 6 years, you have to be able to handle what goes on in terms of negative cash flow and a bad market. So keep that all in mind. Let's start by talking about institutional sources of money. And that's going to a big mortgage company like Washington Mutual, Wells Fargo, or Countrywide, or maybe your local bank, and borrowing money where you have to qualify, meaning you have to put up a credit report, you have to show your income sources, and so forth. That's the most obvious source of money, and that tends to be the cheapest source of money. The reason being is that these institutions have very good programs where they qualify people to make sure that it's minimal risk to them when they're lending to you, which means they're going to put you through the ringer, make you prove all your assets and your income and your credit and so forth. The only challenge with using these institutional sources is they tend to penalize you for getting a good deal. What do I mean by that? What I mean is, let's say you have a house worth $100,000 and you could buy it for $80,000. That's a pretty good deal. Now, let's say the bank says we only lend 80% loan to value. Well, that's not a problem, right? The property's worth 100 and you're going to buy it for 80. They should lend you 80, right? Wrong. Banks are going to lend you 80% of either the purchase price or the appraised value, whichever is less. So, for example, if you're going to buy it for 80, they're going to say, okay, you put down 20%, which is $16,000, we'll lend you the balance. Doesn't work out too well because you still have to put up money. It's actually not terrible. If you have the money, you can put that $16,000 up and borrow the rest, but I thought we're talking about leverage here. Eventually, you're going to run out of money. So we have to find ways to be able to buy properties cheap and still get pretty close to 100% loan to purchase price, not loan to value. That means if you can buy it for 80 cents on the dollar, you can finance it for 80 cents on the dollar. Let me give you a perfect example. I just bought a property. It was from HUD, which is it's a government guaranteed loan program. Said HUD owned it and then sold it. I got the property for $181,000. Property was worth about $235,000. So doing the math, I should be able to borrow $185,000, right? Wrong. They won't lend me that. So what I did was I bought the property cash by using my home equity line of credit. And by the way, this is a great resource for short-term money. Not long-term, but short-term money. So if you've got some equity in a property or properties, you can get an equity line of credit. And the key here is to be able to get as big a line as possible. It's not necessarily the interest rates you're going to pay on the line. It's just how much you can get and how quickly you can get it. In this case, I went and used that equity line. I purchased the property for $181,000. I turned around and put about $12,000 in repairs and turned around and refinanced it for about $185,000. So I had most of my money out of the property. Property's worth about $235,000. And my payment on the loan is about $1,400 a month, principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. And then I sold it on a rent-to-own, lease with option, for $239,000. So that works out pretty good. I got break even. And on the back end, I'm going to make a nice chunk of change. Now, how did I do that? How was I able to get 100% or pretty close to 100% loan to purchase price? Instead of 80% of $181,000, my purchase price, they lent me 80% of the $235,000 appraisal. How did I do that? Well, what I did was got a non-seasoned refi loan. You want to write down in your notes, non-seasoned refi. Typically, when you purchase a property, if the lender's program is 80% or 90%, whatever they loan, they go based upon purchase price, not on value. If you refi, generally they go on refinance of 80% or 90% of the appraised value. However, they usually want to see what's called a seasoning, meaning they want to see that you own the property for, let's say, 6 months or 12 months. And if it's before 6 months, then they're going to go based upon the purchase price, not the appraised value. Some lenders, in this case the lender I used was Countrywide, but many of the other big lenders will do it, what's called a non-seasoned refi loan. Now, they will only do that if it's not a cash out loan. What do I mean by cash out? Let's say, for example, you have a property that's worth $100,000. You buy it for $80,000 and you put 20% down. That's $16,000. And you have, let's say, a loan on that for $64,000. That's the balance. Okay, 6 months later, you want to go refinance the property. You want to get 80% of 100, which is 80, right? Well, you owe 64 rather. You're going to borrow 80. What does that mean? That means you're taking 16,000. Your 16,000 back out. You're getting cash out up and above the liens on the property. That's called a cash out loan. So in the case of a unseasoned refi, most lenders say you can't take cash out. Now it seems counterintuitive here again because I paid 80 for the property, and I just want to. I mean, let's go back to our case. I paid 181 for the property with my cash. I put 12 more into it, and I just want my money back out. I'm not taking out 200. I'm just taking out my money out. It's still cash out. Why? Because when I go to refinance the property, the title company is going to show a title report showing no lien. So any money amount that I get out of that refi is, quote, cash out. So this is what I did. When I purchased the property, I put a lien on the property for $181,000. This is the way I did it. I had a home equity line of credit. I lent $181,000 to an LLC, which was mine. I owned the LLC. So what happened is my LLC wrote a $181,000 note to me, and I lent my LLC the $181,000. That's step one. Step two, the LLC turned around and lent $181,000 back to me. Now you're probably thinking, well, how could you do that? Perfectly legal. You could lend money to a party and they could turn around and lend it back to you. So now the LLC turned around and lent me $181,000 to purchase the property. Now, as collateral for that $181,000, the loan originally when I lent the LLC was unsecured, uncollateralized, was just a note. The second loan from the LLC back to me was secured by a deed of trust, and if you're in a mortgage state, you use a mortgage. It's just a lien that's recorded against the property. So when I purchased the property for $181,000, I put a lien on the property for $181,000. You follow me so far? So at closing now, there's title in my name, and then there's a lien on the property against the LLC. So when I went to refinance the property, title company pulls up the title report and says, oh, there's this lien for $181,000, and they called my LLC, which is owned by me, for a payoff, and we faxed in a payoff of about $185,000, give or take, because, of course, there's interest on that. So the payoff, the amount of the loan that was paid off was $185,000. The bank who refinanced the loan paid $185,000, and the only thing I really had on the table here was about $8,000, which was part of my rehab costs on the property. And it wasn't cash out because the lien that was paid off was $185,000, and the amount of the loan was $185,000. So I know you're probably thinking, this is absurd. Is this lender dumb? How did they not know? They knew. They knew that LLC was mine. But if you want to follow the rule says cash out means no cash out. There was no cash out. At closing, the $185,000 went to my LLC. And in that case, the LLC was made whole with me, the loan they had with me, so we tore up that note and released that lien. Then the LLC turned around and paid me back personally, and I went and paid back my equity line of credit. It's pretty creative, but an interesting way to do it. So again, you buy the property, you put a lien on that in favor of an LLC that you own, and then at closing you just pay off that loan and it's not cash out. So that's how basically I got into the property with almost no money. I had about $8,000 on the table with the repairs, but still, it's a great deal. I got $8,000 on the table, I got breaking even cash flow, and in the end when I sell it for $239, I'm going to make a nice big chunk of change. So that's just a creative way to get into a property with little or no money down. The other way to do it, and this is the way, by the way, I not recommend you do it. This is the way that a lot of investors are doing it. Let's say the property's worth $100. Let's say you're going to buy it for $80. So the investor goes to the seller and goes, okay, I'm going to give you $20,000 down so that the bank is going to lend me $80. But after the closing, you're going to write that $20,000 right back to me under the table. That is loan fraud. That is something you should not do. That is something you will eventually get caught at doing and you will go to jail. Likewise, another way that you should not do it is to lie and say you're going to live there. When lenders lend money, there's two broad categories of loans in terms of loan to value and qualification criteria. One is an owner-occupied loan where you're going to live in the property. The other one is non-owner-occupied where you're not going to live in the property. And by the way, a lot of the stuff I talk about in my book, Financing Secrets of a Real Estate Investor, you're going to want to pick up a copy of this at Barnes & Noble or Borders or Amazon.com, or you can go to my website at legalwiz.com and click on the store. You can order this. The owner-occupied loan, you can get as much as 100% loan to purchase price. That's if you're going to live in the property. Some investors lie. They say, oh, I'm going to live there. It's my primary residence. They get 100% financing, and they never end up living there. So you don't want to do that. That is loan fraud. I do not recommend you do it. I also don't recommend that you give the down payment to the seller, then pass it back onto the table. That is loan fraud as well. But what you can do, however, is find a lender that will allow you to get an 80% loan as a first and allow the seller to carry back 20% as a note and second on the property. So that way you can get into the property with little or no money down. Now, in our case, if it's worth 100 and you're buying it for 80 and the seller expects to get 80, if that lender is going to give you 64 and you're going to give the seller a note for 16, does that work for the seller? No. What I'm talking about is if the property is worth 100, you're going to put a loan on there for 80 and give the seller back a note for $20,000. Now, that is a purchase price of 100 now, we're calling it. And then you have a note for 20. Now, how do we deal with that note? Because technically you still owe the seller $20,000. And I've seen investors do exactly that. And then after the closing, they just wait a month and they tear up the note, and or they give the dollar, they buy the note out for $1. That's crossing the line pretty close. I'm not saying that's loan fraud, but that's walking a very, very, very fine line. Let me show you a variation of how I did that. I had a property that I was buying from the Veterans Administration. It was a repo, and the winning bid was $138,000. The property was worth about $175,000, and this is the way we do it. We did it when we call the tag team approach. I talk about this in my book, Financing Secrets. This is a pretty nifty way to do it. The purchaser on the contract with the Veterans Administration, 138, was my partner. Basically, what my partner and I were trying to do is get into the property. We were going to put a little bit of money to rehab, and then we were going to sell it on a rent-to-own and then split the profit. That's what we were trying to do conceptually. But here's how we did it logistically. The partner went and put in the contract for $138,000. The partner of mine then turned around and sold it to me for $175,000. So we had one contract to buy for $138,000, one contract to sell to me, the tag team partner, at $175,000. Now, the VA expects $138,000. That's all they're getting is cash, $138,000 on their side. We did it in a double closing where I, the investor, was going to buy it from this middleman, my tag team partner, for $175,000 on an 80-15-5. Write this down, 80-15-5, meaning I'm going to borrow 80% of the purchase price, 80% of $175,000. The seller, who was the middleman here, was taking back a note for 15% of the balance and was getting 5% in cash. And doing some rough math here, if I remember correctly here, $175,000, we borrowed, the loan was about $140,000. So $140,000 was 80% of $175,000. That was the loan from the bank. The balance of the $35,000 was paid as follows. I gave the seller $7,500 more or less, and then the balance, which was $27,500, was a note. So at the end of the transaction, I owned the property, titled in my name. The bank had a first loan on there for $140,000. The seller, who was the middleman, had a note for $27,500, which was a second on the property. And then the seller, who was that middleman, my partner, had my $7,500. And this is what we did. After the closing, they used that $7,500 to fix up the property. And then we turned around and sold it on a rent-to-own for $179,000. You follow me so far? At closing, when that tenant buyer exercised their option, their bank calls up the middleman seller, my partner, who's got this $27,500 note, and said, what's the payoff? The payoff was half of $27,500, which means that they got half of the $27,500 as profit, and I got half of the $27,500 as my profit, plus the difference of between the $175,000 we bought it for and the $179,000, which is an extra $4,000. So in essence, in the beginning, I put up $7,500, and in the end, I made about $15,000 in profit. So, I mean, really, conceptually, what we were trying to do here is my partner and I trying to buy this property for $138,000, put about $7,000 into it, sell it for $179,000 and rent to own, but we didn't want to put up a lot of cash. We were just trying to work around the bank's rigid down payment rules by creating two transactions, both of which are perfectly legal, perfectly above board, but you have to think outside the box. You have to be able to be creative and work around the rules without lying, without passing money under the table, without saying you're going to live in a property. Those are all illegal things. We're just trying to be creative. We don't want to do anything that's going to create a situation where if it got audited, you'd be in jail. In lawyer talk, we call that the straight-faced argument, meaning if you ever got dragged into court and you were going to do something, you have to be able to tell the judge with a straight face and not laugh when you say it. So although this is creative, sometimes we walk that fine gray line. You don't want to step over that line. You want to do things above board. Okay, sometimes you make a little less money. Okay, sometimes you have to put up a little more money on the table, but it's just not worth it. Look, if you find good real estate deals, you don't need to do things that are borderline illegal. If you buy properties cheap, if you make the right deals, you can find financing, you can find partners, you can make it easy to buy the property. So don't focus so much on, gee, how can I buy properties with no money down? How can I buy properties with no money down that make sense, that make it easy to get financing for? That if option A didn't work out, I have two other options that would work, and I would still come out of this deal making money and smelling like a rose. So be creative, but don't walk over that line. Let me talk about some other sources of financing. Other than the institutional sources, it would be hard money. Now, hard money is equity lending, meaning a lender is not necessarily looking at your credit or your income. They're looking at loan to value, and they're not going to go 80% or 90%. They're going to go more like 60 or 65%. And that can be useful in certain circumstances if you get a deal that's super cheap. If you can get, for example, a seller who owns a property pretty close to free and clear, and they're willing to take back a note on the property. I'll give you a perfect example. I had a seller who owned a property pretty close to free and clear. They needed a chunk of cash, but they didn't need all of their equity now. So I went and borrowed a hard money loan for a third of the purchase price at 14% interest. Now, by the way, hard money means you're going to be paying a high rate of interest, 14, 15%, sometimes 2 and 3 points. But it worked out because the seller carried back the balance of the purchase price, which was 2/3 of the price, at 0 interest. And when you could borrow money at 0 interest, it's extremely profitable. So while I had a third of the purchase price at 14%, I had 2/3 of the purchase price at 0% interest. I used that 1/3 down to give to the seller. That's all the cash that they needed, and I was able to carry the balance at a very favorable rate of interest, which is 0. So there are creative ways that you can use hard money, and more importantly than the cost of the money is the availability of it. If you could find money in a pinch, that's really important. I talk about in my book, Financing Secrets, a deal where I was going to buy this condo from HUD, and it was a really, really good deal. And I had a problem with my regular financing source who was supposed to lend me money and was just really at the 11th hour. They fell through, and I needed money in a pinch. I called up a hard money lender, and I was able to borrow money, even at 14% interest, 2 points. But what it did is it gave me a little bit of breathing room, gave me a couple months to go out and shop for a good financing source that I ended up refinancing it and having a good loan. So sometimes hard money is worthwhile, especially when you compare it to bringing in a partner. So for example, if I was going to buy a property and I got a really good deal on it and I borrowed hard money at 14% interest and 2 or 3 points, that might seem like a lot of money, but compared to what? Compared to bringing in a partner and giving the partner half the profit, it may seem actually rather reasonable. Another source I talked about earlier is using your home equity line of credit, which is basically like using a big credit card. Now, I must caution you not to use the home equity line of credit for long-term deals, meaning don't use that home equity line as a down payment and then borrowing the rest from an institutional source and leaving that money out there. I think you should use hard money and home equity lines of credit for short-term sources, meaning you can run in and in a pinch snatch up a property to bargain and then turn around and try to refinance it within a couple of months and then put that money back. It's a very effective short-term source of money. Another source of money, which is cash, is your own cash out of your IRA or your SEP. Now, if you don't have a self-directed IRA or SEP, you should think about setting up one. A self-directed IRA or SEP is basically a custodian that will allow you to direct your investments into real estate, so you could basically use your money as cash to buy properties and then turn around and sell them quickly with basically no tax, meaning your IRA is buying and selling it, which is a tax-free, or in the case of a traditional IRA, a tax-deferred transaction. Very, very effective way to do it. If you don't have a self-directed IRA, you should get one set up by setting up a custodian such as Equity Trust, which is the one I use, equitytrust.com, or Entrust, which is another excellent source, entrustadmin.com. Two excellent resources for setting up a self-directed IRA or SEP. And they will help you out with some of the rules and regulations for buying and selling properties inside of your IRA. There are some hoops you have to jump through. You have to learn the rules. But once you do, you can use it as a very effective resource for buying and selling properties. Another excellent resource for buying and selling properties is owner financing. Owner financing is getting the seller to carry back some or all of the purchase price. So for example, in our $100,000 house, if you could buy it for $80,000 and get the seller to carry back 20% of that, and then you can get a new loan for the 80%, then you're getting in with no money down. Another way to do that, let's say, for example, the seller owned the property for, he owes $80,000 on the property, and basically he just wants out for his loan. He's selling it to you for $80 because he just wants to pay off the loan. And that's a good deal for you at $80 if it's worth $100, and you could buy the property for $80 and pay off his $80,000 loan, but why would you do that? Why would you do that? A better way to do that is to get the seller to just deed you over the property subject to the existing loan. That means you're just going to take the deed to the property, you're going to leave that existing lien on the property, and you're not going to pay it off right now. You're going to continue making payments on the seller's existing loan, and then 6 months or a year from now, you go to a bank and you get a seasoned refi. Meaning you go to a bank and say, I've owned this property for 6 months, or I've owned this property for a year, and you have. Now, some people get a little confused about that because they say, well, you've owned it for a year, but the loan is still in the seller's name for the year. It doesn't matter. When the banks look at seasoning, they look at how long you've been entitled, how long you've owned that property. So if you've owned that property for 6 months, and you turn around and go to a lender and go, okay, it's worth $100, lend me $80 or lend me $90, and then pay off that seller's loan. Now, I know you're going to say, well, wait a minute, that loan has a due on sale provision, which allows the lender to accelerate, meaning force you to pay off that loan if they find out the title has been transferred. And that is true. However, the chances of that happening within 6 months or a year are pretty slim. If the bank's getting paid, more than likely they're not going to care. If the loan does get called, let's say it gets called in 2 months after you transfer title, in that case you do an unseasoned refi. And the same thing, you're just doing 80% of appraised value. You'll get a better rate and you'll get a better deal. You'll find more sources of financing if you go with a seasoned refi, meaning you've owned it for 6 months or a year, but it still is possible to refinance it based upon appraised value before 6 months and an unseasoned refi. But chances are the lender's not going to care in the short term. So if you can keep the existing financing in place, and let's say if the seller owes maybe $70, you just give the seller $10,000, take a deed to the property, and then you're just going to refinance that property after 6 months or a year. I talk about how to do that in my alternative financing course, which you're going to want to check out at legalwiz.com. Just click on the store and you can read all about how to buy and sell properties using that type of financing. One other strategy, which I do actually talk about in my alternative financing manual, is how to buy and sell properties using an installment land contract, also known as a contract for deed. What that is basically a contract for deed is going back to our example where the property is worth $100, the seller owes $80, and then the seller would just deed it over to you, and then we would take subject to the existing loan. Well, the seller might be a little leery about that. The seller might say, well, what if I just deed it over to you and you don't pay my loan? What recourse do I have because I don't own the property anymore? And he's right. He's in a bad legal position because he doesn't own the property. You do, and if you don't make the payments, he's got to step in and make the payments on a house that he doesn't own anymore. So you could do is buy the property on an installment land contract. That's a contract that basically says you're going to make the seller payments that mirror the payments on his loan. We call that a mirror wrap. I talk about that in the alternative financing course. It's called a mirror wrap, where you make payments to the seller that mirror payments on his underlying loan, and then he continues to make payments to his bank. And then when you're done paying off that seller, when you're going to refinance the property, he pays off his existing loan and then transfers title to you. Now, the good thing is that the lender is not going to find out about the transfer of title because there was no transfer of title. So the chances of the lender calling the loan are pretty slim. It also helps satisfy the fears of the seller that thinks, gee, what if you don't pay my loan? Well, the seller's still got title, so he still has some leverage, legal leverage, if you decide not to pay his loan. So a contract for deed or installment land contract is a very, very effective resource for you to acquire properties. And again, I talk about that in my alternative financing course. I have all the contracts, all the specific legal issues, how to set it up to make sure that it runs smoothly. You're going to want to get a copy of that manual at legalwiz.com. Just click on products. So we talked about different financing sources. We talked about borrowing from banks. We talked about using some of your cash or from your IRA. We talked about hard money. We talked about owner financing. Another resource would be to bring in a partner as a financing source. So let's go back to our example where the property is, let's say, worth $100 and you could buy it for $80. You could find a partner who could put up the money and the financing. So for example, if it's worth $100 and you could buy it for $80, you can get a partner to come in and put 20% down, the $16,000, and have your partner go out and qualify for the loan, or you qualify for the loan for the $64,000. There's a lot of variations to that. Bringing in a partner alleviates the issue of either A, running out of cash or having no cash in the first place, or B, having no credit or running out of credit, running out of the ability to borrow more money from institutional sources, which is the cheapest form of money, by the way. A lot of people talk about buying properties with no cash and no credit, and I'm a big advocate of that, but let's be honest. If you have lots of cash and you have lots of credit, it makes the whole process easier. But if you don't have those things or you have a limited source of those things, you can always bring in partners. But here's the key, folks. If you're going to bring in partners, what does that mean? That means you're splitting the profit. And if you're splitting the profit, what does that mean? That means you've got to find better deals. If you've got that 20% equity spread, and that's good for you, if you're only going to get half of that, you're going to have to bring in a partner. You're going to have to get maybe a 30% equity spread if you're going to be splitting it with someone. So keep that in mind, that there's got to be enough profit to justify two people being involved. If you're going to bring someone to the table, then they're going to want to say, hey, I'm putting up all this money, I'm only getting half the profit. Maybe you might have to give them 60% of the profit, or maybe you just have to find better deals. But the key thing is to bring in people who have something that you don't, either lots of cash or lots of credit. If you've got lots of cash and lots of credit, you don't need partners. If you've got talent, if you can go out and find good deals, and that's the most important part of all of this, the money will be easy to find. You'll be able to attract all the partners you need. So going back to our example, if the property's worth $100 and you could, let's say, buy it for $80, you can get your partner to put up the 20%, the $16,000, and put up their credit, which is, in this case, borrowing a loan for $64,000. And then after closing, the partner who acquired it in his name would deed the property over to, let's say, an LLC, which you and he own 50-50. And then you'll go find the tenant buyer to sell it to in a rent-to-own at, let's say, $105,000. And on the back end, you guys split the $25,000. This could work out pretty well. Or if the partner runs out of money, doesn't want to do that, maybe the partner will put up $80,000 cash, and then you can turn around and refinance it after 6 months on a seasoned refi. There's a lot of variations to do this, but again, going back to my original premise, if you get good deals with good equity, it's very easy to find the money resources. More importantly than having the money is having, number one, the knowledge of how to put these transactions together, the knowledge to learn how to put these transactions together. And once you have that knowledge, taking that together and going out and taking action to go out and find the deals. If you have the knowledge and you go out and hustle and you find good deals, no problem. The money will find you. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and I hope you take the time to learn these principles, go out and take action, succeed, make money, and let me hear about it. Thanks for watching.